I'm going to try and ask the first question. This is something that we talked about at a lunch meeting, but I think it's particularly relevant here. In the last 2 weeks, China passed a law or clarified a law that requires all NGOs, all Christian parachurch organizations, all other NGOs, faith-based or not, to register with the Public Security Bureau, or they will be kicked out of the country. Now, this is a great concern and is right in line with what you're talking about, but I think it's a step further. Not only is China becoming hegemonic in the region externally, but now they begin to look at foreigners to boot them out. And they've had a history of that in the past as well. Would you care to comment about that and the concerns strategically, militarily, and security-wise about that?
Well, I would say a couple things. One thing that the Chinese are paranoid about is falling into the same trap as the Soviet Union fell into. And when the Soviet Union started to reform glasnost, perestroika, I'm probably not saying that very well, thank you. One of the things they allowed was certain types of NGOs to operate. Remember, one of the most powerful groups that ultimately helped bring down the Soviet Union were environmental NGOs, interestingly enough. And so they looked at this and they said, some of these NGOs, they may actually be the black hand of the United States and others who want to bring us down. So they have this expression about the black hand of foreigners trying to bring down the Communist Party of China. So they look at the Soviet Union, they look at the Arab Spring, and they say, yeah, some of that was organic, but look what was also going on. You had U.S. NGOs and development assistance organizations that were in there fomenting the Arab Spring. And they say, we don't want to allow that, and so we're going to put these restrictions on NGOs and make sure that we can control them if anything gets out of control. The other thing they're paranoid about and worried about is their own history. And they have their own, in their eyes, in their view, their own difficult history with Western NGOs, to very much include religious organizations and Christian missionaries. And what was the expression you said? After the gunboats come the missionaries? That's an old expression in China related to their own history, which they're very insecure about. So I was saying earlier, I don't think the law is solely and exclusively directed at Christian organizations and Christians, but I think it's probably informed by their own history with those groups to certainly make it foremost in their mind as they were drafting this law. And it does concern me. I think it's going to potentially complicate things a great deal. It means they can pitch you at any time they want just to say you're violating the spirit of this law. And I hope the people of China respond to that in the right way, which is to support the work of NGOs and to really look at some of the more problematic aspects of this law and find ways to either work around or find ways to comply and name only, but operate as we have always operated, because I do think these NGOs are doing terrific work, certainly in the missionary field, but other NGO work in rule of law and legal training, human rights, environmental groups. So I think it's very important, and I think the Chinese government has taken a step in the wrong direction.
Mr. Schriver, thank you so much for such an incredibly fascinating address. My question to you is, having worked for Republican administrations and watched what I think is a debacle of U.S. foreign policy weakness over the past 8 years, we are facing a grave choice. A man with zero foreign policy experience and whose solutions are kind of like comic book answers to problems, or somebody who is so incredibly incompetent as to bring us things like Benghazi, the reset with the Russians, etc. I'd very much like to hear what you think of the job the Obama administration has been doing recently, what you would do as an expert in the field if you were president, if you could determine our foreign policy, military policy, and where do you think Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton would be likely to take us? Very simple question. How much time does he have?
Wow.
Can I attempt to depoliticize that question a little bit? Well, I think for me, it's important that a leader have several qualities. I think first and foremost, they need to believe in American leadership, and some would say American exceptionalism. I don't think that's a partisan statement to say that our leader should believe in that. But I think, the consequence of not leading, I think, is pretty clear. And in some cases, it's more fundamental. There are people that don't even believe it's our proper role. They don't even believe that it's something we should be doing, and that that Americans may see themselves as exceptional, but other countries also see themselves as exceptional. Well, I think by objective measures, the United States is an exceptional country, and I want a leader who embraces that and implements a policy based on those beliefs and doesn't shy away from leadership but grabs the mantle of leadership. And because I fundamentally think the world is a better place when we lead. Do we make mistakes? Do we sometimes leave things worse off than we found them? No question. No question. I believe my administration that I served in had some pretty bad mistakes. But I think as a general proposition, when American leads, the world is better off. So that's number one. Number two, I think we need a leader who understands how to integrate all the tools of national power in a sophisticated way. I don't think it can be all military, all hard power, all threats, bomb them back to whatever, and nor can it be all soft power, nor can it be all diplomacy, nor can it be all, extend the hand and talk to all our adversaries. And it has to be a very sophisticated, smart blending of those things. And I think that's hard, but I think understanding how to do that is really critical for a leader. I think also, third, a leader who can get out of the inbox, get out of the day-to-day pressures and really think strategically. And for me, that's Asia and that's China. Do we have to deal with ISIS? Oh, absolutely we do. That's a very repugnant, necessary challenge that we've got to take on. But is our future really going to be bogged down in some of these places? I don't think so. I think the future is in Asia, and I think dealing with China should be a much higher priority than it's been. Maybe that sounds self-serving. Maybe that sounds like it's a bias that comes from my own background. But I think we can't continue to afford to be sucked back into other regions without giving Asia our full due attention. But if you don't agree with me on the specifics, maybe you agree with me on the general proposition. We need a leader who can think strategically and think longer term than I think we often have. So yeah, why don't I depoliticize it and just tell you that those are the qualities that I would look for. To the extent I want to be political, I don't see that in the current crop. And I think, we're going to have some tough choices coming up after this election. If it's one of the two who are either the presumptive nominee or the expected and likely nominee, we're going to have some tough choices. And some people will be asked to serve across party lines, possibly. Some people are going to be asked to put country ahead of party, country ahead of their own personal disdain. And, I hope we can rally together to do that, because the stakes are too high. The consequences are too great if we don't. So.
We hear a lot about, on television at the moment, bring back the manufacturing jobs to the USA. I'd like to expand that and say I think a lot of countries in the West should bring their manufacturing jobs back to their own countries. How practical is it for Western manufacturing companies to turn their back on China and bring jobs actually back both to the USA and Europe? Well,
I would say the problem is not just China. The problem is if we say, you know, we're tired of China being the manufacturing hub of the world and them, you know, taking our jobs, guess what? There's a lot of countries that can step in and take their place and are taking their place. Manufacturing is starting to spread throughout Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Cambodia, to some extent, Malaysia. They all can do what China has done historically the last 30, 40 years, be a place for cheap labor to perform the final assembly of low-tech, low-end products for re-export. They can all do it. So it's not just China, it's a global phenomenon that it's simply become more difficult for us to compete in this space. The other is there are real structural changes to our economy and structural changes to the way we manufacturing things. I had a discussion after our breakfast this morning with somebody who was talking about sort of the revolutionary nature of robotics in manufacturing, something I know almost nothing about. But by the end of the conversation, I thought, wow, it's going to be a lot harder than I thought to bring manufacturing jobs back to this country. So I think if you look at China and say, we solve this, we get manufacturing jobs back, I'm afraid I find that to be not, you know, fully appreciative of the challenge. I think it's beyond China. So do I have an answer how to bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States? You know, I think there are things we can do that we haven't fully leveraged. You know, the United States, we still have, you know, a greatly educated populace. We still have rule of law. We still have transparency. We still have a lot of things that make the United States an attractive place to do business. Human capital, human resources are excellent. Cheap energy helps. It's a lot cheaper to do manufacturing in the United States when you have cheap energy, and maybe the shale gas revolution will lead to a manufacturing rebirth. It's not out of the question. But I do think we have to prepare for a future that it's simply going to be different. It's going to be less reliant on manufacturing jobs, whether that's China or anything else. Yeah.
I would echo what Randall says. About 10% of the U.S. economy is based on manufacturing. That's all. And it's going to continue to decline. Certainly we can have high-tech manufacturing, we can have some complex manufacturing, but it's time for the politicians who you hear to realize and speak the truth that we live in a services economy. And the services economy doesn't always mean it's just people at McDonald's or fast food. That little cell phone I have over there, which I bought in China, by the way, Huawei, and every cell phone you carry is chock-a-block full of patents and intellectual property. That's our expertise. We are an intellectual property economy. And the development of intellectual property, the protection of that, is crucial to our going forward. In fact, it is a big issue in dealing with China. Can they protect intellectual property that we have, the United States has, in the way of international patents and trademarks and the like? That's an area that's not always talked about much anymore. But I do think you're right. We have a fundamental shift in our economy. It's to the services economy, and we need to focus on how we can create more and more jobs and opportunities through that.
What do you perceive to be the strategic implications for the United States in particular and the West in general of the so-called Strategic Cooperation Organization between Iran, China, and Russia? I'm thinking specifically with respect to the enabling of Iran's nuclear ambitions, but not just that.
Well, let me start by saying I'm highly suspect of an organization whose mission statement is counterterrorism to invite Iran to join. So I think there's been other things going on other than just talking about global terrorism. I think the China-Russia relationship is a complicated relationship, and I think there's a marriage of convenience there of sorts. There's an energy relationship. There's a military aspect, but the Russians are still suspicious enough of the Chinese that they don't sell their best stuff and release their best technology. And they have a very difficult history. They've fought one another and had ongoing border disputes and tensions. And look, I mean, Vladimir Putin is what he is, but I think even he knows he's overseeing a country that's in decline. And in real ways, they're in decline. The life expectancy is growing shorter. I mean, this is a country in decline. They're a one-trick pony with energy. They can bully for a little while, but I think his concern should not just be, how can I bully the Baltic states? How could I, bully Eastern and Central Europe and use energy as a tool against them? I think it should be how he can get his country on a better footing and a more healthy footing. For China, they look at Russia and they say, population poor, resource-rich country. We can work with these guys. We can extract from them what we can for as long as they'll allow it, and we'll benefit from it. The relationship I'm a little more concerned about is the China-Iran relationship. All our cooperation on the nuclear problem notwithstanding, the Chinese have a very different relationship with Iran, and they have very different aspirations. And I've been told point blank, as soon as this deal begins to be implemented, we will resume arms sales to Iran. So, yeah, they cooperated with us on the nuclear deal. I don't know what you may think of the deal, but they cooperated with us. But will they help us when it comes to the other problems that are associated with Iran? Their support for international terrorism, their support for groups that are challenging Israel. I think the Chinese won't be great partners on that front, and in fact, a lot of ways will be enabling Iran. So I worry about that one, and I think we haven't fully come to grips with it ourselves.
Let me take that one step further with Russia. It is not the Chinese who are sending airplanes to destroy civilians in Syria or the Middle East. It is not the Chinese who are destabilizing Taiwan. It is the Russians doing it. Ukraine, look what they're doing in Ukraine. Look what they're doing in Syria. They also want to be an empire. So can you take that one step further? It looks like the Chinese are, I would consider them even more considerate than the Russians, the way they're handling the Middle East.
Well, maybe in those instances that you describe, Russia is a bigger problem for us now. In fact, I'll remove the maybe. Russia is a bigger problem for us. I'm not sure day to day I can tell you what we're trying to do in Syria. I mean, at times it looks like the Russians are partners, in helping us with the deal on removal of chemical weapons. At other times, it looks like they're bombing the very people that we've been trying to arm and support. So, yeah, I'm not a particular fan of what the Russians are doing in the Middle East, and certainly not what they're doing in Ukraine and Crimea. But I guess I would challenge, and if you look at the Asia Pacific, who is behaving in a way that's destabilizing, the Russians are barely present and barely actors in the Asia Pacific, in the Western Pacific. And it's really the Chinese assertiveness in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and Taiwan where I think the problems are emanating from. So I grant you the point on Russia's activities in Ukraine and Syria. I guess I'd push back a little bit on the question in Asia.
Hi. Given that China holds so much of our debt, how much influence can we expect to exert over China?
Well, let's put it into context. They are the largest foreign holder of our debt, but they are not a majority holder of our debt. In fact, I forget the exact percentage. I think it's less than a quarter. I think it's somewhere in the 15 to 20%. I might be getting that off. Japan is number 2 as a foreign holder of our debt. They're almost as large a holder as China. They're pretty close to one another. So in terms of foreign holders of our debt, between China, Japan, and other international holders of our debt, it's less than half. So that's some context. But when it gets to the question of leverage and what this means, I think we have to remember, why are the Chinese where they are in terms of holding so much of our debt? this is not a great favor to the United States to be supporting our profligate spending and our deficit spending, and it's not that they want sort of strategically to gain all this leverage to then turn against us and use it against us, I would argue. Why do they do it? It's in their interest to do it. Where are you going to put all that currency if you don't put it in U.S. treasuries? You're going to stuff it in the largest mattresses in the world in Beijing? Are you going to put it in Europe? Are you going to put it in Chinese banks? That would be the last place that they would want to put it. So they put it into our treasury bills because it's the safest, securest place to put their money. Could they change that behavior? Sure. They could sell. That would come at a transaction cost, and then they'd still have the problem, what do we do with all this cash now? They could over time adjust and start to buy less and less. Frankly, that'd be just fine with me if it was a gradual slide to holding less of our debt over time. That'd be fine with me. So I think the concern about sort of a precipitous action would ignore the part of the equation that the Chinese would pay a price for this too, and there'd be consequences for them. So this is really, we're sort of mutually intertwined on this one, as far as I'm concerned. They're doing it because it's in their interest. They're doing it because it's a safe, secure place to put money. And we're doing it because we can't get our deficits under control and our debt under control. I have never really seen this as a great source of Chinese leverage the way I've heard some people describe it. But there are certainly people that don't agree with me and would say that it's something we need to actively work against and try to reduce. That's not where I'm at on this issue, but there are other opinions for sure. Do you have an opinion on that?
No, but I'm going to offer opinion on something. Okay. Give you a break to think, and then I know you've got a question coming up. One of the things you mentioned was the Chinese government is fearful of its own people, and probably with good reason. Our experience when we've taken students to China, a couple of them are in here, is that, and this is probably not a surprise to you, the Chinese people are different from their government. Just as I'm not a big supporter of our government, but the Chinese see me as different, as an American, and not my government, and I think too often we may view the Chinese as their government itself, so we need to be careful of that. One of the things that I found fascinating is that I saw a stat the other day, and it's been confirmed in a number of different sources. About 1980, there were estimated 1.5 million evangelical Christians in China, 1.5 million. Today, the estimate is, pretty good estimate, about 150 million, 100-fold growth. The biggest Christian nation on the planet is not the United States, but China. So God is powerfully at work in China. And yes, we need to be concerned about the policies and programs that the government is involved in, but God's the leavening agent in China in many respects, and that Christian movement is powerful. Right, Joe? You were with us in China. Seeing those Christians and those Christian churches, that just makes you stunned by how powerfully God's working in that arena. And so, yes, I'm fearful about what's happening with China and the government. That's true. But would you care to comment on that in any way, shape, or form? And then certainly we'll come to you in a second.
I think you said it very well, and I agree. I think I said earlier, it's probably one of the most underreported, underappreciated aspects of what's going on in China, and they are certainly fearful of it. You know, from a Chinese perspective, do they have good reason to be afraid of their people? Well, look at some of their recent history. The Taiping Rebellion in 1860, 1865, 60 million people. 60 million people killed. Some say it's the most death from a single conflict in the history of the world. The fall of the imperial rule around the time of the turn of the century, very violent. The communist Kuomintang Civil War, tens of millions of people killed. The Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, 30 million people dead. There's a lot to be concerned about. If your intent is to hold power, not reform, not allow active participation in governance through representative democracy, there's a lot to be afraid of. But I think, they're really missing what is an opportunity. And you said God will have the last laugh. I'm sure that's true. But if the Chinese were, I think, a little more clever, they would see that you can be a great, powerful country and a country filled with people of faith, which is what we have here. And again, when George Bush and people like that talked to his Chinese counterpart and others in China, and he talked about his own faith, but also his hope that there'd be greater religious freedoms in China, he came at that issue from a position where he was truly hoping that China would be a greater country and that its people would become greater. It wasn't about we want to contain China or we want to make things difficult for the government in China. We want China to be a great country, and we think you can only be a great country if you really unleash people to practice their religious faith freely and to let God do his work.